All right, so we're moving on to this second paper in this session titled The Persistence of Paper, a case study in microfinance from Ghana, presented by Ishita Ghosh.
Hi, good morning. My name is Ishita Ghosh, and I'll be speaking about this project today that came out of my summer internship with the New York University in Abu Dhabi this past summer. Essentially, what we were interested in was trying to see how and why paper persists in low-resource settings, and we looked specifically at a microfinance institution in a city called Tema, right outside Accra in Ghana. All right. So we know this, right? We know that paper is ubiquitous. There have been ambitious claims that go all the way back to the 90s, where people have claimed that organizations and workspaces will eventually achieve a paperless state, right? But if you just look around observationally, if you look at the literature, a lot of work has been done in this space. We know that this is not the case. There are many unique properties to paper that have been well documented, right? Paper is lightweight, it's low cost, it's portable, it's very, very familiar, it's easy to manipulate, fold, share, etc. Paper has also endured in low resource settings in the developing world, and it's interesting because we are at this ICTD conference right now, which kind of exemplifies this movement to digitize, especially paper-based tasks and processes, right? And to some beneficial end, of course. Yet paper continues to play an indispensable role in information ecologies around the world, right? And so with that in mind, let's dive into the project a little bit. So if I just do like a quick Google search of like microfinance institutions in the developing world, these are the kind of typical images I see, right? And what is sort of common about them is that you do see a lot of use of paper. Right? So you have these workshops in self-help groups or savings groups, you know, where you're trying to disseminate information or broadcast information to your entire group. And paper is used for recording and storing data, both at the client end as well as at the provider end, right? So paper in microfinance especially has been studied by Tapan Parikh, who couldn't be here, unfortunately. And he's talked about these things, right? He says that paper is, in fact, deeply embedded in local information practices. It is sort of the time-honored platform for recording and storing microfinance data. And it's very well understood, right? Which sort of makes it easy to own and trust. And this trust aspect is especially critical when it comes to the microfinance industry, right? So in general, the microfinance industry is formally regulated to some extent, and informally driven to a very, very large extent, right? So when the typical microfinance customer is low income, low literate, and I don't just mean that they cannot read and write, but also that they have low financial literacy levels, right? In that case, they're sort of vulnerable to information deficiencies in this ecosystem, and they rely on both institutional trust, right, where they actually trust the microfinance institution or the central bank that's regulating it, as well as on interpersonal relationships with the microfinance agents, for example. And apart from this, and you know, I'll talk about this more as we get into the project, these customers are constantly looking for like markers of trust, right, that sort of secures their position within the microfinance ecosystem, all right? So that is some more context on that. So what we do, and I was trying to be clever here, so in this paper on paper, is that we talk about an ethnographic assessment that we did of the paper passbook, specifically in a microfinance context. We sort of do an analysis of unique paper properties in the context of low-income, low-literate populations, right? We do like an analysis also of the costs and benefits of using paper versus technology. And then what I'm going to leave you guys with is a brief exploration of the paper technology spectrum. All right. So we did a qualitative field study for over a period of 3 weeks in summer last year. And during this time, we were just following microfinance agents into the field, right? And we were sort of really observing each transaction that was being conducted. And, you know, this was interspersed with a lot of informal conversations. And towards the end of that period, we also conducted in-depth interviews with 27 customers. We also did a usability study of the paper passbook, which was basically done to ascertain the utility that that passbook provided to the customers themselves, right? And so we devised some very straightforward tasks. We had 14 customers perform them. We timed it. We, observed them, completing these tasks. And any irregular or atypical task completion strategies were, we made a note of it. And we, of course, conducted follow-up interviews after. So I'm going to spend some time talking about the paper passbook. I'm not sure if it's very clear, but all right, I'll talk about it. Now, the thing is, the problem that I had while I was preparing for this presentation was that there's a lot of detail that we have in the paper that, in the interest of time, I won't be able to really get to in this presentation. So I do encourage you to go ahead and read the paper, but what we're going to do here is just sort of talk about the most salient features that support my concluding arguments in this presentation, right? So let me just talk about the microfinance service that we were actually even tracking, right? So it was called a SUSU savings program, right? SUSU is savings in tree, I think. And basically what would happen is when a microfinance agent or a mobile banker, as he or she was called, would meet a potential new client for the first time, they would tell them that, look, you save a standard deposit amount for 31 days. At the end of that cycle, or month, as they called it, you will get 30 days worth of deposit amount as your savings, and the 31st day's amount goes to the MFI as commission, right? Once this was done, the first thing that the new customer would have to do was to decide on a standard deposit amount that they were comfortable depositing on a daily basis, right? So in this case, if you can see, if you look at the third column, it's 2 CDs. This guy has decided to deposit 2 CDs on a daily basis, and that's about equal to around 50 cents. And after that, there was sort of this ritualistic transfer of the paper passbook from the microfinance agent to the customer, right? So the agent would affix the photograph of the customer into the paper passbook, fill in his details, put a very formal-looking stamp, and then hand it over physically to the customer. And this sort of firmly established, the customer's ownership of the paper passbook in that system, right? After that, the deposits would begin. So what would happen is that the microfinance agent would go on a daily basis either to the customer's home or to his workplace to go and collect the savings deposit in person, right? And so the deposit was fairly straightforward. He would just write the date on which the deposit was made. He would write the standard amount, which was just like a column of 2, 2, 2, 2, 2 through and through. He would then sort of write the cumulative amount in the fourth column, right? So 2, 4, 6, 8, etc. And the other thing that I should mention here is that 2 sheets would basically represent one cycle, right? So you have that first sheet, and then you turn it over, and that looks like the sheet on the left, and that represents one cycle of your savings, right? And withdrawal was also fairly straightforward. Let's say this customer has decided to withdraw all the money on that sheet of paper, right? So it's about 18 rows, so that's 36 CDs. So all the microfinance agent would do was make these big red strikes across the page, and then scribble a little bit inside it, just to drive home the point that this money has been withdrawn and you can no longer use it. But what was interesting about this was that even after having done that, the customer could still see that historical log, right? Could still see all the money that he or she had deposited over time. And in fact, one customer told me, I remember, that another MFI would just tear off the pages once a withdrawal was made, and he didn't like that, right? It seemed to him that that was an untrustworthy action on the part of that MFI. Why would they need to tear off those pages? So this fact that they had this complete visual transparency into the historical logs of their money accumulation over time was greatly reassuring. The other thing that I want to talk about is, these are low-income customers, right? At best, their daily financial lives are precarious. So what would happen is that sometimes they just didn't have the money to make the daily deposit amount. Sometimes they would have extra money at hand, right? So if they didn't make a deposit, they didn't make a deposit, right? That was fine. But let's say they had some extra money at hand which they just wanted to put into their deposit account. So let's say this customer deposits 10 CDs, right? The way the microfinance agent would write that down into the passbook would be to write it as 5 deposits of 2 CDs each, right? And you can see that in this example as well. If you look at the, I'm not sure if it's clear, but if you look at like the 4th column on the 9th of June, I think, the person deposited 4 CDs. And so the mobile banker has broken that into two deposits of 2 CDs each, right? And that happens again, you know, in I think the 7th column and then the 9th column, right? And this was great because it actually mirrored exactly the intended premise of the SUSU deposit collection, right? And so it really simplified the message and the processes for these customers. And you would think that with this kind of visual transparency, customers would really, really interact with the paper passbook even between transactions, but that was not the case, right? What we did discover through our observations and through the usability study was that people barely used the paper passbook, right? They could not even read it. What we did in the usability study was that we gave them a passbook and said, tell us what the balance is you know, in this account. And they could just not look at the last cumulative account and, you know, come to that answer. Instead, what they used was something that we call the approximation hack, which is that we had filled up this first page and about half of the second page, and we said, so what's the balance? And they knew that 2 sheets equal to, you know, in this case, let's say it's 2 CD as a deposit amount. They knew that 2 sheets equal to about 60 CDs worth of deposits, right? So 1 full page would be about 30 CDs, and half of the next page would be about 15. So they would come up with the answer of 45 CDs, right? The interesting thing, though, was that that was not precise because there are actually 18 rows in the on the first page and 12 on the next, right? So, but it was fine because they had an approximate value, which would, and it was within a reasonable margin of error, and it would eventually rectify itself the moment a person completed the entire cycle, right? They would have that answer of 60 CDs at the end of it. And this was especially something that low literate populations were doing a lot, sort of like holding that paper, turning it and being like, yeah, you know, 2 sheets is equal to 1 cycle's worth of savings. The other thing that I wanted to mention before I move on was that customers, like I said, would never interact with the paper passbook in between transactions. So as soon as the mobile banker ended up writing, you know, the details into the passbook, they would just put it into this black polythene bag, tie it up, and store it away. Or they would give it to the mobile banker for safekeeping, right? So this fruit seller that I spoke to in the open market said that it might rain, right? It might get wet. The paper passbook might get damaged. And she wasn't aware of the fact that there was actually a replication of this data happening at the provider end as well. So to her, that physical artifact was the only thing in the world that preserved her information, right? So she really attached a deep value to it. And even though she could not really read it, she was confident that in case there was any discrepancy, she could take that passbook to the headquarters and have them navigate the situation in her favor, right? The other thing to talk about here is that this starts to point at how people really develop interpersonal relationships with the mobile banker. So I want to, and to the mobile banker's credits, right? They do all kinds of things to encourage this. They part with their mobile phone numbers. They, you know, give people their home addresses. People go and check and say, oh, this person looks like they're part of this community, so I can trust them. They're generally amiable in their demeanor. And there's some other things that go on in the field that we saw through our observations, and I'll describe one such story, right? So sometimes people in certain kinds of jobs, for instance, people who had a high churn of customers in their jobs or who worked in the garage as mechanics and didn't want to soil their paper passbook, they would just leave their deposit amount and their paper passbook with a trusted aide or friend, right? And what happened in this particular case was this hardware store owner had his deposit amount, his passbook, and 2 of his friends' deposit amounts and passbooks as well, right? So when he handed over everything to the mobile banker, he gave 15 CDs, and she was supposed to enter 5 CDs in each of the 3 passbooks. But for whatever reason, she got confused, and she entered all of the 15 CDs into his passbook, right? So you can see on the 3rd of July, she's made 3 deposits of 5 CDs each, right? And so when the guy saw that she not even opened the passbooks of the other 2, you know, of his friends, he realized that there was a mistake, and he alerted her to that fact. And all she did at that point was she made these 2 small markings in the paper passbook, right, just to sort of show that, oh, you know, I have made a mistake. And so the next time that he made those deposits, she didn't have to fill it in, right? It just rectified itself. So what the hardware store owner told me was that that was great. Like even weeks later, when he opened his passbook, he could still see those little markings, and it greatly reassured him, right? It really made him trust the mobile banker. All right. So I'm just going to like sort of talk about the properties of the paper interface really quickly. The first thing that we noticed was that paper, you know, this idea of like natural inscriptions and visual transparency, right? So I just spoke about this example where an error was made and there was some sort of way to counter that, right? So this mobile banker was able to immediately alter the paper platform, right, which was outside of its prescribed usage, but which demonstrates the vast space of visual markings that paper can sustain, right? And paper also, without activating, like without any additional exertion, paper just affords that complete visual transparency, right? Be it when you're doing the, you know, the withdrawals and you do the red strikes, which is sort of communicating some sort of instinctual action to the customer, or the fact that you can see the historical records beneath it, or the fact that you have to break down every deposit, right, into multiple installments of the standard deposit amount, and that this mimics the premise of the SUSU or the savings microfinance service, and it really simplifies the message for them. Also, just physicality and perceived value, and Tapp speaks about this in his papers as well, right? It's very reassuring to people to have that physical artifact with its dedicated function of being a paper passbook, right? It really gives them some confidence in the whole, you know, system. And you would think that paper is low cost, so people would not consider it valuable. But the moment you dress it up, you know, with a stamp, with an official logo, people are able to attach a value to it, right? Which may go beyond just its monetary cost. And finally, control and ownership, right? A person who is low literate, right, and he gives his passbook to the mobile banker, it's hard to imagine the kind of control they can exert in that ecosystem, right? But that ritualistic transfer of like, here is your paper passbook, it's now yours, really helps them think of the paper passbook as their own. So when they're giving the paper passbook to the mobile bankers, they just consider it sort of an ancillary act of, you know, safeguarding the passbook, right? And the approximation hack that I spoke about is a good example of how people, you know, because they're familiar with interactions with the paper passbook, they're able to sort of navigate this information overload in a way that is meaningful to them, right? So I guess just the final takeaways that we want you guys to, you know, sort of take with you after this paper is that, you know, take a deep breath, pause before you consider sort of a wholesale blanket digitization of existing paper-based tasks and processes. Paper is low cost, so if cost is a constraint, that would work in your favor. And it's not just monetary costs, right? It's like if you have low income, low literate populations who might be sensitive to sudden overhauls, there might be acclimatization costs, there might be training costs involved, right? And in general, because paper is familiar and you introduce an alien sort of platform in that system, it might end up alienating them. So it is something to think about. And the final thing that I want to leave you guys with is this paper technology spectrum, right? So there has been some work in this domain where you sort of have these paper technology hybrids that leverage the unique properties of each to varying degrees. And so even when you jump from paper to like a wholesale digital solution, there are these options that you might consider. And I don't have time to talk about them now, but Chen and I are doing an open session tomorrow, shameless plug. If you want to hear more about paper composites, paper prototyping, paper computing, etc., please do come. And with that, I'm done.
Okay, we have time for a few questions.
Yes, my first question is the recording of the amount they pay, whether 2 cities or 5 cities. Is it just to make it simple for them? Or did you find out if that is the initial amount they have stated to the microfinance, that is what they will pay? The second question is, what is the difference between this passbook and owning a passport? Thank you.
Owning a passbook and a passport, is that what you said?
A passport, a national passport.
What is the difference between owning a passbook and a passport? Oh, huh. There's a lot of difference, right? I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly. Well, I'll just answer your first question. So the amount that is, it's not decided for them. They're asked what amount they're comfortable with depositing on a daily basis. And so, they sort of consider their own income, expenses, et cetera, and they come up with that figure themselves.
So then it's not really to make it simple for them to understand. It's just to indicate that you indicated to pay 2 cedis every day or every week. So the 6 cedis is 3 times of what indicated to pay.
Right. So I didn't imply that the actual amount was what simplified the message. It was the breaking up of that, right? Which you had to do in that paper passbook because you don't have the affordances of a digital solution where you can just enter like a final cumulative sum, right? And it was great because they could see it sort of increase over time. And a lot of them kept a mental tally in their heads as well, right? Like because they could not sort of parse the passbook themselves. So this would kind of map to their mental model in that sense as well. And I guess the point eventually is that it doesn't matter whether they deposit, 2 CDs or 10 CDs. What they have been told to like simplify the whole process is that every day you deposit 2 CDs. And this just mimics that.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. We do some work with micro-entrepreneurs here, and we face some of these issues. We try to teach them bookkeeping using Excel sheets. So we teach them Excel first and then bookkeeping. But then when we do the workshops, most of the times we end up ditching the computer and Excel, and we end up doing everything on paper. But I think from our perspective, it's also about the risk of not having this information, or the risk of not having the option of using one, or at least knowing that. So in here, for example, you also talked about it's also about being financial literacy and stuff like that. But what are the risks that they're facing by focusing on this, or by perpetuating this use versus having another alternative?
What are the risks of using paper versus a digital solution? Oh, there are plenty, right? I mean, risks would include like if it does get damaged, and if you've not been maintaining data at your backend properly as well, you'd risk that complete loss of data, right? And of course, there are many like cons, so as to speak, about using paper a lot, which is that A, you're using so much real estate, right? And eventually that might become a cost factor just because you're using so much more of paper, right? So the idea here is not really to romanticize paper by any stretch of imagination. I guess the only thing that we're trying to do here is to ensure that, like, look at it very carefully, consider some of the things that we've talked about, some of the things that you probably uncover from your own needs assessment, and then really decide what solution might work best for you.
Hi.
Oh yeah, hi. Sorry.
Yeah. Really interesting talk. Thank you very much, and it's really useful to see these ethnographies and histories of documents. It struck me that the passbook has evolved as a very interesting information artifact that you could say is carefully designed now or has evolved. But I'm wondering how conscious the MFIs are of the quality of the particular paper artifacts that they're using. Because I remember meeting a chap from the World Bank, and the World Bank were pumping some huge sum of money into a state in India for a microfinance program, and they'd printed out a whole load of paper books that had no lines and were disastrous as information artifacts. They were destroying their entire program by the failure to actually design, basically a graphic designer and an information designer for 5 days could have saved them from wasting N million rupees or N million dollars. So I'm interested, I think it would be useful to take the work forward and look at the, if you like, the knowledge ecology within the microfinance industry of the qualities of their things and how they're exchanging knowledge about, what works well, what doesn't work well.
Certainly. I think to some degree, though, part of that familiarity that customers have with paper passbooks is that eventually they've gotten used to the standardized format, right? Passbooks across MFIs, after a while, tend to look fairly similar, right? And I'm sure that's come after years of some sort of, knowledge sharing on that front. At the same time, though, there are some differences, right? So like this MFI that's staring pages when a withdrawal is made versus, these strikes, right? And it is true, though, when we were sort of interacting with the people who did own the MFI and we spoke to people there, they weren't necessarily aware of these more nuanced sort of, properties of paper. And they, in fact, were actually considering a digital solution, right? So I think that was part of the conversation that we had with them, where we sort of told them our, what we found, et cetera, and, hopefully they took that into consideration.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, hello. So I really like the analysis that you did about the affordances of paper and the positive affordances, but I think a paper-based information system has many negative affordances. And I think the interesting thing here was that all these, this particular community had a mobile banker who was trustworthy and who was there, like the central reason why that system was successful in this case. So I wonder if you could comment on sort of their role in this paper-based system, and how will we be able to incorporate that into the spectrum that you mentioned?
Oh, absolutely. The microfinance agent's role is absolutely critical to any kind of mobile banking sort of ecosystem or microfinance kind of ecosystem that's happening on the ground. It's terribly, terribly critical, right? But at the same time, it's important not to isolate that mobile banking agent or that microfinance agent as the only reason why people are sort of, deriving trust or like gaining trust in that system, right? It kind of works as an active network. The paper passbook helps. The fact that there's this MFI that's been there in the area for 12 years, that makes a difference. All these sort of common, factors come together, and people learn to like look for these markers of trust. All right.
Thank you.
Great.